I need to remember to do that earlier.
Yep, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's important.
And
Okay.
maybe I can also just quickly mention that we have our group discussion area. Here, I'll put it into the chat window. This is for taking notes on this page. You can go to the bottom of the page, and there's a space that while we're working, you can take notes. And if you have ideas pop up, I can jot them down here. It also has the agenda, the outline of the agenda.
Cool. Thank you. And so now I'm going to share screen. And this is what we showed you last time. This is our Empathy Circle little Google website. The homepage, all the links. And under materials, we've added a few new features. So we have, this is the online How to Empathy Circle Guide online one pager that we looked at and you all gave input to now, Word version of it. And now we have a new version. This is version 2.0 of How to Host an Empathy Circle. And you can all open it in your own browsers as well. If you could send out the link to that, Edwin, that would be great. But you know, there was some conversation about the importance of adding a purpose statement. So we had this small paragraph we added. Empathy circles are a great way to support creativity and good thinking, to build connection and empathy, and to develop our listening skills. They are also quite simple to host. Below is the basic format. As host, you can choose a starter topic from the list on the bottom of this page or come up with one on your own. I'll just zoom to the bottom for a second. We thought it would be useful if we had a list of potential topics that people could use for a starter empathy circle. So we added that at the bottom and took out the thing that was there before. And then we tweaked a bit. Someone had said you're not choosing the person, you're asking them. So we said yes, we want to ask someone else to be the active listener and have that person agree. And then we tweaked a little bit, the tips for the speakers, the tips for the active listeners, and then we left the tips for the silent listener as well. So it's a little longer than one page right now, but we figured some of you said that the short version might end up being 2 pages. And then we don't have a graphic yet, but we were just working on the text. So that's what we were working on in response to all of your comments. And Edwin, did you add to the chat the link so that people can get to the Google website on their own? I think you did, yes?
Mm-hmm. The overall website is right here.
Cool, thank you. So if you could click on the link and take a moment to look over it, and we'd love to have any feedback if you guys have more feedback. Chances are, if it's easy to incorporate, we will, but if not, chances are that this is pretty much going to be our draft for now, and we'll be moving on to creating other parts of the materials.
Just a quick thing. So the work that I had done was a 1-page as well. It's on that link that he just put in. So that's you can kind of look and see in terms of how I was translating it, some of the same kind of feedback, having like an objective statement. And then the other thing I included was a place for clarity of what the roles were. Valerie,
where is your draft that you were working on?
On the actual page that you guys have right there, the Empathy Circle 2017 Sprint, down at the bottom, you had that materials doc where it was a collaborative one. So I just cut and pasted my stuff into that.
Oh, great. Okay, so
everyone can look at it there.
Cool. I'm going to share screen, and this should be, okay, this should be coming up. Okay, I see it now. So in the materials doc, okay, so you put in an objective.
And I just kept it really simple because I figured that I like your little lead in, but maybe that's not on the page. Maybe that's like the lead in to the link for the page.
Yeah,
But I was just trying to keep it really streamlined. So the objective, and then I realized that like clarity around what the roles are for people to wrap their heads around the framework of it would be helpful. And then the basic how to, and then just some consistency around the fact that we give tips for each one of the roles.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just put in that as a stand-in prompt, but we could change that. You know, it was just the idea of having a prompt listed clearly.
Yeah, this is great. We had put conversation starters at the bottom, so it's the same kind of an idea, and we had a number of different ones, and I really like the "What's Alive in You."
That's Edwin's, just fair, you know, truth in lending. He shared that one time in one of our empathy circles. So credit where credit's due. But
Yeah.
I like what you guys have as well. I think that for me, when I was trying to think about how to do this, the idea of being really clear up front about what the big picture is, the objective, and then clarity around here are the roles, right? So that there's some for me, I need to have the framework, and that before I get into the details. And so that would be my only kind of, because I basically took the same content for the most part. I changed it just a little, but it was just more about how to kind of get people's heads wrapped around it before you get into the how to.
That's great. I really like this, but Valerie, I especially like that one of the things that came up in the conversation last night with the Tuesday night group is looking at different contexts where we might use empathy circles. And so one of the contexts is schools. And especially if we're working in a school context, it's really important to have objectives and roles and things like that for teachers who are thinking in terms of lesson plans for their classes and things like that. So this is great. And I think that we'll either combine this with what we did, or else we'll have two versions, and preferably we'll have three versions.
I'm so sorry, my dog is barking, so I can barely even hear you because he's going so crazy. But the one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think last time we talked about skins, you know, like in software, people, or with phones, like sometimes people talk about having different skins on something so that it has like different looks for different audiences, even though the thing underneath is basically the same. And so one of the things we've talked about, for example, with regard to the graphic, is that we might have a graphic that's more young people oriented, and we might have a graphic that's more classroom oriented, and we might have a graphic. So,
well, in this one, I did have a chance this past weekend to kind of use this, and so this one was I gave that as a handout to just kind of help people have something in writing. I talked over it, you know, so I facilitated it. So if somebody was doing it on their own, unfacilitated, maybe it's a different version, right? But this was all for adults, and it seemed to be something that they, you know, were able to understand it and do. So anyway, so just wanted to throw that out there.
How exciting!
Yeah,
you piloted this process. That's really cool.
Is there a link that you could put in for? I was able to find the document, but if
so,
a link to it, or
so where it is, Edwin, is at the very bottom of the materials page.
Yeah.
Where it says the following doc is a collaborative doc that you have been all added to, so we can all contribute to it. And then you click on that open materials doc to edit, and that's where Valerie wrote her version in. So very cool.
And again, I'm not attached to any of it. It was just, you know, that's how my brain works. So I figured I'd offer it up.
Yeah, that's great. And so in a little bit, we're going to be breaking into small groups again for brainstorming. But for right now, we're going to stay together and continue this conversation, because there's one more thing along these lines that I wanted to mention that came out of all the rich feedback that you guys gave us last time. And so how do I find it? Where is version 2? Okay, so we might make yours version 3, and as I said, we might incorporate it, or we might just begin. Okay, so two things. The first thing,
Looks like Rosa connection got dropped. Let me see that. I'll pick up from where she was. Next on the topic here, I'll put that in, was this in the, oh, there she is. So I just put in the link to Crystal's document, and that she's in the Tuesday group.
Yeah. So, but before we go to Crystal's, I wanted to share one more thing, which is that we had talked about how after the session, you and I had talked, Edwin, about how in both of our small groups last time, it had come up, this question about how and when does the listener pause the speaker. And so we had a long conversation about that, and we incorporated it in the version that we created in the 2.0. And our thinking was basically that, like, when we did the check-ins this time, and it's just a 2-minute thing, we don't really need to pause the speaker for that. But when we're doing an empathy circle and people are taking longer turns, like maybe up to 5-minute turns, that we can't expect the listener to be able to hold all that, especially when they're just starting out. And so that the focus in an empathy circle, unlike, say, a focusing turn or NVC turn, it's not like this is 5 minutes that the speaker has. That's just like their time. It's like this is a turn that the listener and the speaker are taking together for the purpose of helping the speaker feel understood. So we thought that for that purpose, it would be really helpful if the listener can actually indicate to the speaker, like, you know, can we have a pause here so that I can reflect back? And anyway, that's what we hashed out and incorporated into this round of it. And we were really curious to get your input about how that lands for you.
I had a question about that.
Yeah.
I'm glad that was incorporated, actually, because even in this time when Renal was talking, I wanted to interrupt her after her share because I was really moved by it and I felt like I needed a pause between that and the next one, but I didn't, because I just didn't know what the most loving way to stop somebody is, basically. Like, this feels like a little aggressive speaking. I was thinking, like, as she was talking, I was like, is there some like universal sign that could happen that then the other person could agree to or not? You know, like, it could be like, I don't know, like some sign that doesn't have other associations, that is for the process, that then let's say she wasn't done with her part of the story and emotionally she needed to keep going. Like, she could choose to not agree to stop right then, you know? And, or if, as it was the case this time, it was going to be a whole other topic, I'm sure she would have said, yes, we can stop. You know what I mean? So anyway, those are my thoughts. I don't have a suggestion except for this. But yeah, just like, I need a moment.
Yeah, I need a moment. Right. Right.
I don't know.
So let me reflect back that when you were listening to somebody, you felt like you wanted to invite them to pause before they switched to another topic, and yet it's awkward. And so you're exploring whether there might be some kind of hand signal or something. This feels a little too harsh, but maybe something that would help ease the transition, and also that the person could respond or not, that it could be a little bit like a negotiation back and forth. Yeah. Yes, Myrtle.
Yeah. It's quite a lot connected to what she was just mentioning, and it's the other side of the story. And so I would just break it into 3 points that I see the questions might be when somebody is organizing empathy circles. The first one is, like she said, that if you want to interrupt someone, So interruption comes a little later. First and foremost, when we organize such a thing, I would be more confident in understanding that who takes precedence, in the sense, is it the speaker or the listener? Because if we understand that pretty well in terms of the emotional level to which it has to be dealt, I think that solves the question that even Eliza asked. That's my point one question. If I need to stop here, I can ask my question later.
Well, actually, I'd love to reflect back just because I'd like to understand what you're saying, right? So your first question, and you have three, but your first question is that you think it would be helpful if we were clear about who is taking precedence, the speaker or the listener, and that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yes, because like she said that she was kind of moved by hearing what I shared, but at the same time, I was equally heavy on my emotions. So I like quickly wanted to change gears and switch it to something positive, right? So I didn't want to hold on to that conversation for even a second more, right? So it as a speaker, it helped me just control my emotions, which could have perhaps gone overwhelmed if I didn't switch at that moment. That's my perspective. And she has, as a listener, has her side, right? So the situation can happen to any conversation that we would have whenever a dialogue happens. So then, as organizers or as designers, we need to first understand that which side of the emotions is it that we have to weigh more.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So what I'm hearing you say is that as the speaker, you were really wanting to stop the focus on what you had just said and move to something different and more upbeat. And so for you, it would have been hard to have had a reflection right then. And so that's why you think that it would be important for us to explore, to be clear about whose emotions are going to take precedence when we're talking about these introductory empathy circles. Yeah, okay. Eliza. Oh, wait.
Yes. Oh, here's three.
Could we have somebody who hasn't spoken yet?
Can I just respond to this?
Sure, but can you just hold on for half a second?
Of course.
And I don't know if there are other hands right now, but if there are, then we can come back to this. So, okay, go for it.
Well, I just want to say that in response to that, my understanding what is right now that the speaker kind of takes precedent in a way, which is why I didn't respond, and that to me feels good. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So thank you. So do you want a reflection for that? And does somebody else want to reflect what Eliza said? Yes, Salvador.
I was thinking about why empathy is useful. Why?
But before we go there, I was asking for a reflection for what Eliza said.
No,
Is there somebody who would like to reflect? If not, I will. So, Eliza, you were saying that for you, you were assuming that the speaker takes precedence, and so that's why you didn't step in, and for you, that feels good. Is that basically it? Awesome.
Yes.
Salvador.
What I'm thinking is that if I am as a speaker, I'm really listened to by other people. If the other people allows him or herself feeling, that is very choose me, even if the other person doesn't say anything. So in that sense, I think that it's more important for the speaker to be able to express in a way that he or she feels that needs to express. At the same time, I think that can be shared at the beginning the possibility that the listener might stop to say something or to ask a question when the speaker thinks that needs to understand or to verify if he or she is understanding well to the speaker.
Yeah, so again, would someone like to reflect what Salvador?
I'll reflect back. So Salvador is saying that not dissimilar, I think, to Eliza, that on some level it's we're trying to make it about the speaker, right, and create the safe space for them to be able to express, and that the listeners need, or the possible interruption may cut off the speaker's flow, and it's more important, even if we never reflect anything, for them to just feel heard. So again, I think it's Salvador saying that it's more about the speaker ultimately, right?
Okay, thank you. Well, this is really interesting. Edwin and I have kind of landed on a somewhat different place, and maybe this is just a place where we can all experiment and see some of the reasoning for what we were thinking about. Is that there are already practices where the speaker is the one who is being heard. So like in focusing, that's how it works. And that's great. And I'm not quite sure about NVC because I know a little bit about NVC, but I don't know how empathy circles work in NVC. So in this practice, we were talking about how it's a relational thing. Like our purpose isn't necessarily for empathy. I mean, our purpose is for the speaker to feel heard, absolutely, but it's for the speaker and the listener to work together to help the speaker feel heard. And so it actually wouldn't work for us to just have the speaker just go on and on and on and the listener not have a chance to offer a reflection, because in the empathy circles, we are wanting to give an opportunity also for the listener to reflect back. And then there's two other things. One is that in our society, it's really common for there to be like kind of an instinct of like, so many of us don't get heard enough that when it's our turn to be heard, to kind of like hold on to the ball and kind of want to take off and run with it. And the thing is, we're not going to really feel heard until we get a listening response. So the listener can't take the ball and run with it and talk about anything else, but they can't say, but I don't know how. I don't know if it's time out. I don't know if it's, this. I don't know. A friend of mine has a pinky sign that he uses when he wants a breath, like when somebody's going on and he just wants them to pause so that he could, pinky sign. But there's some way, like in our culture, the person who is speaking is the one who has power, and the listeners are the ones who are not empowered. And so how do we equalize the power between the speaker and the listener so that it isn't the speakers the ones who always have the power? So anyway, that's a little bit of a summary of the conversation that we had afterwards. And and it sounds like a lot of you really want it to be clear that it's the speaker who has the priority, as Myrtle said. And what I'm wondering, Myrtle, is whichever way we do it, it's important to be really clear at the beginning. And so if you knew that at the beginning that the speaker and listener are working together, and that at whatever point the listener feels that they can't hold anymore, they can do a sign or something, I wonder how that might affect what you share if you know that you might be asked to pause at some point. I don't know.
Who's going? Yeah. Is it me?
Yes.
Yeah, can I? Yes. Okay. So while I was hearing all the reflections and suggestions, I think one thing that held very, closely is that both the parties need to actually communicate during this conversation. And why I'm saying this is, even as a speaker, like I shared one perspective that I wanted to jump over that emotion, but at the same time, I wanted to know that I was being heard. When I say that, I mean to say that when I was switching between the emotions, if in between, like this was a very limited conversation that we were having, like of only 2 minutes, but if it was a lengthier one, then I would want to know that if what I'm saying is being heard, and perhaps a little intervention by the listener won't hurt my emotions, but only if we understand very categorically that, this is the end of the one emotion or one notion that the speaker wants to communicate. But I think perhaps that's the challenge that is not very clear when people communicate.
Okay.
So Edwin, would you be willing to reflect back what Myrtle said?
Okay. So I was a little distracted here, but I wanted to, what I was hearing is that there's, when you're sharing, one piece, that at the end of that, you're wanting to know that you're heard for that one piece before transitioning to the next?
Yes. Perhaps I'll just paraphrase this a bit, that when we say silent listener and when we say active listener, I think silent listener is also doing the same thing like Eliza did, right? She would not, the person would not intervene in between the conversation, but that's where the active listener's role starts, that they need to understand and know where is it that they have to start responding, or where is it that they have to, perhaps hold hand of the speaker, or just let them know that they're being heard. I mean, this is where I'm coming from.
So it's the active listener has to have an awareness of where it's a good point to step in and reflect. So they have to be kind of sensitive to the felt experience and know that, oh, right now I can jump in or not.
Yes. So that it doesn't appear like the conversation is being cut off. And at the same time, it's like, as a speaker, like I was sharing both my emotions, that I wanted to jump from one emotion to other. But at the same time, it would have been great if somebody just told me on the way that, yeah, you're being heard.
Mm-hmm. So you actually, after this was a really a deeply felt sharing that you were doing, and it would have been supportive for you to have received a bit of a reflection at that moment before you transitioned into another experience, sharing another kind of experience. So you would have found it supportive at that point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think it would be a win-win for Eliza and me both. So both our problems get sorted there.
And it's interesting, Myrtle, because when we were planning today, we thought, well, we're doing brief check-ins. We're only doing 2 minutes. So we don't need to bring this up beforehand. We don't need to have the conversation about, is it okay for the listener to say something? Because I guess what I'm trying to bring up is how context dependent it is. Like if we're just doing very brief turns, then it might not be necessary, even though in this case it actually did come up, right? But definitely if we're doing 5-minute turns, I think it would not make sense for somebody to go on and on and on and on for 5 minutes, and then for the listener at the end of that, especially when, again, part of the context is we're talking about introductory circles for people who have not done empathy before. We're not talking about advanced circles for people who have done 20 years of focusing or 20 years of NVC, right? So when we're working with beginners, how do we make the first step where we are caring for the speakers and caring for the listeners as well? So that was kind of our thinking in having it be, as you put it, a conversation between the two, whether it's a conversation with hand signals or a conversation in some way. But I definitely encourage you to try it different ways, Try it one time and say, for this thing, it's the speaker's priority and they can speak as long as they want. Or for this other one, we're really working with the listeners. Or for this other one, it's going to be a negotiation between the two. Because I think that's how we learn, by trying it different ways, carrying out experiments, and then seeing what happens.
Sure.
Yes, Valerie.
I just want to, when this part of the conversation started, I had to step away for a moment, but I just want to throw in my 2 cents that in my experience, when I did this past weekend, it was with a bunch of women that were in a workshop. I was just doing sort of like a mixer. That's what I was using this as a tool for them to reflect on a topic that was tied to the content earlier, and that then they were connecting and supporting one another by just, sharing kind of what was coming up for them. And they were all novices, right? So this is, no real solid listening training or extensive, work. I didn't have a lot of time to even ground it terribly. But I think that what I did, some of the feedback I did get was this idea of like, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to worry about getting it right, that you're co-creating it was helpful for the listeners, the active listeners, so that they weren't all caught up in anxiety around that. So I do think, I personally, my vote is, it is important to have both. But at the same time, that active listener can't make it all about them. And I think that the setting expectations or managing expectations up front about whatever the ground rules are, and making it clear that it's a practice, right? And it's something that you're going to work on, and you're going to work together and support one another, is an important piece to just make people be able to relax into it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think another consideration that comes up for me is that sometimes when people receive a reflection, something shifts in them, and then they come up with a new thought that they hadn't thought
Absolutely.
before.
Yeah.
And so how to have the reflections happen sooner, so that it's not just like somebody saying and saying and saying and saying, and then at the end getting the reflection. There's no space to kind of have it be a little bit more of a experiencing, wow, what comes next after I hear a reflection. So that's part of it too.
And your point about the fact that we often will hold on to the ball and keep, just, feel very much like we've got the mic, right? that is a habit that people are in. And so this setting it up front, like, hey, there's going to be this give and take, and you need to take a pause so that we can, so the active listener can reflect back throughout the process. Setting that expectation up front, I think, helps people. They weren't all really successful at it. Like, there were definitely, I think there was about 18 women. I broke them up into groups of 3 just for the time's sake. So I would say maybe about 3 or 4 of the women, they just talked the entire time, right? Like, I gave them 5 minutes max. They talked the entire time. And then when I gave them the 1 minute warning, the poor active listeners had to try to like quickly reflect 4 minutes worth, right, in a minute. But the majority of them did have that kind of back and forth, and it felt like it was going naturally. So some people, I think it's a hard habit to break.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Also, if you'll notice, whenever somebody shares the actual experience that they've had, we learn a lot. So for instance, you just said that you gave them a 1 minute pause. We don't have them like a 1 minute, like warning. We don't have that in the current set of instructions. And I'm sitting.
That was only because I had a hard and fast time that I was working with, and so I just kind of did the little chimes, like the little.
No, I'm thinking, what a great idea to like give people a 1 minute alert there, and maybe we can include that as, depending on your context, you may want to bring something when it's 1 minute before the end. So in case they haven't had a chance to get a reflection, they can have a reflection then, right?
Yeah.
So there's so much that we learn by doing, by experimenting it with different ways. And boy, I really know about that challenge of, even if you ask people to pause, it's so hard. And part of that comes because I've done a lot of interpreting, like from one language to another, Spanish to English, English to Spanish. And so you have the person who's going to be the speaker, and you ask them to pause every so often so that the interpreter can interpret. And they mean to, and they want to, and yet it's such a hard habit to break that I think there's something about empowering the listeners too, to be able to remind the speaker to pause and having it be a dance. Because if we just leave it all in the hands of the speaker, it can be a challenge.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful conversation, all of you. These have been some really interesting thoughts. And again, I just really like, multiple possibilities. So maybe we could have 3 scripts, with like different ways of doing it, and people can choose, take it out, see what happens, what they learn, and then come back with that. So for this, yes, Myrtle.
Just one point I would like to add here. When I was working in the corporate, one of the communication trainers just gave me this tip. So I just wanted to share that if we can incorporate that in our empathy circles. So for the smaller conversations like we were discussing today, like a 2-minute conversation where we don't really want to take a pause. So she just said one thing, and that was like, when you're in a continuous conversation, so even if it's like a 1 second break that the speaker is taking, if the listener can say, sure, I understand, it just helps. It takes the burden off the listener, and it just lets the speaker know that, yeah, being heard. So I think that used to work in one-on-one conversations, but I'm not sure because I don't have any prior experience of empathy circles, but I just thought I would share this if that can be incorporated in a group conversation and we are doing something like this.
Thank you, Myrna. Sure. So I'm gonna, I'm just have an eye on the time right here. So I'm not going to reflect that back if it's okay, but I think Edwin did capture it in the notes. So that's awesome. Cool. Thank you. So some of you asked for some more small group time last time. So we thought we would plan some of that in. We have a feature on Zoom where we can break into small breakout groups. And the idea was that in the small breakout groups, the conversation would be a bit of a brainstorming in terms of what would be included in the 5-page document or so this is, we've been talking right now on this 1 or 2 pager that's something that we hand out. But say that we're still at, stage 1, beginning empathy circles, but somebody wants to have a few more questions about it, or maybe an FAQ, or maybe, and so we have the notes from the conversation last time on Tuesday about this, and we can go over some of those ideas and then see what else we can come up with. But what other materials, resources, etc. So what we're the large goal is we want like empathy circles in a box, right? So you open the box and what are all the various tools you need? And one of the things is this short instruction guide, but then there may be some other things in there that give you more background or that answer some other questions. Does that make sense, what the design challenge is? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna form the breakout groups here. And let's see. Breakout group 1, assign. Okay. So
We're all muted.
There we go.
Okay. Yay.
Hi.
Hey guys.
So we're brainstorming in a small group. What do we need in the 5-page document? And we have, let's see, we have the chat window here. We can put in the link. This is the document that I think most everyone's in it. And it's on page 3. I'm just taking some notes. So we can just brainstorm and start throwing out ideas, and can also, if you want to reflect what we're hearing, we can do that as well as take notes on the bottom of page 3. So
did you want us to look at what they came up with yesterday, or are we just doing this on our own first? I'm fine either way. I was just
I would say I'm not just kind of finding documents. There seems to be so many documents moving between them. I think it's a little bit difficult. Maybe just what you've seen the the original one page, the extended, and then also what Valerie you put together. So what else do we really need? For like a 5-page, what would we want to cover in that, Martin?
Well, I think right off the top, some kind of little chat about what empathy is.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly a lot of confusion out there about what empathy is, especially with Paul Bloom's book, and you're cognitive and you're emotional and sympathy, and people get quite, well, what is this empathy that you talk about? Something like that.
Okay, so some clarity around the definition of empathy, because of there's so much unclarity, and that's sort of a problem, and be really clear on that. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep, just throw it out.
I'm just adding on to Martin's point. This was my question too, which I was mentioning in the common conversation, that we have a lot of confusions around what empathy is. But I think more than the definition, if we can be more clear on the communication aspects of empathy, how we communicate empathetically. That is perhaps more important, because one, people don't understand this term. Two, they don't know how to, even if they understand that, okay, if this is empathy and this is how it is different from sympathy, they don't understand how to communicate empathetically. So I think it should be more communication language that we need to be clear on this particular point. That is something I wanted to add.
Mm-hmm. So communication aspects, like how do you actually do it? Like, how does it actually work, or how do you actually do it?
Yeah.
It's like, mm-hmm.
Well, and I want to second that. Sorry, keep going.
No, please continue. I'll add it.
No, I just want to second that, because that was the thing that in my experience this past weekend, I teach, we call it active listening in professional circles, but I teach this in communication 101 classes, or influencing classes, in lots of different contexts, this specific skill. And it's something that people don't get, because they think they know, they think they're good listeners, but they don't really understand what it is. And this was the challenge for me this past weekend, is that I didn't have any time to really be able to do how to empathetically listen. All I had time to do was how to do an empathy circle. And so I had to trust that this was a pretty supportive group of women empowering women, and that they had enough basic skills and understanding. So you'll see in the little things that the one or two things I added was just like 2 lines about what is empathetic listening. And I put that under the active listening tips section, and then I talked over it really quickly. It was very straightforward, but they would have benefited from a deeper dive on that section, because that's, I think, the biggest hang up for most people. So that's, and I just so you know, in that little thing, I just wrote down my thinking, which was, there's got to be some introduction. Let's see, I think it was it Martin's point about what is empathy? And then I just added Miriam's point about communication aspects and how to and what it is. And then I put that maybe some benefits and usage cases. And then the actual maybe 1-pager of how to do an empathy circle. We can just take that and put that in the 5-pager. And then frequently asked questions and a closing. So in my mind, that's sort of how an outline might be shaping up.
Mm-hmm. So that's on page 3, bottom of page 3. We already have all those listed there.
It also might be helpful to give examples of what's not empathy, and just as contrast, and to put what's helpful about compassionate listening, or about like supportive listening in terms of like creating a dialogue around solutions. But by highlighting the contrast, it might clarify what empathic listening is and empathy circles are.
Mm-hmm. So really contrast it, maybe give an example of this is a failure of empathic listening. This is what it looks like.
Well, yeah, but as opposed to putting it as a failure, this is a different form that's not serving our purpose, which is this, and it's not serving it because of that. So for example, like if I had, like I could have responded to Myrtle by saying, I'm so sad with you and I'm crying right now and my heart is breaking with you, you know, but that's not, I was feeling those things, but that's not what we're doing here, you know? So the benefit of speaking that way is it's compassionate, you know, but it's not empathic. And so it's not saying this way is bad. It's just saying this way is not the way that we're practicing. Yeah.
So it's like if you're going into like a sympathetic approach, which is, you know, real for the listener, that it's first we want to listen to the speaker, and then when it's your turn, you can share those feelings and kind of showing maybe how that works.
Yeah, saying that sympathetic response is not a mirroring response. Like our job is not to express our feelings as the listener. Our job is to mirror back what we heard. And when it's helpful when one would be helpful versus another, you know, because a lot of tools, the benefit of tools is knowing when to use them, you know?
Absolutely. When I teach this to professionals, their tendency is not sympathetic. Their tendency is to get into judgmental, like they're trying to analyze and fix. And so the way I do this is in the beginning of the communications aspects of this, I kind of talk about the different types of listening, that there's evaluative, like where you're evaluating an idea is certainly an important piece of, you know, listening, but that's different. That's not when you're trying to connect with somebody, and when you're trying to create a safe space for them. When you're starting to try to fix or evaluate or diagnose, when you're dealing with a person, it has unintended consequences sometimes, right? And so just trying to frame it up for, hey, there's a time and a place for that, but here's when you want to use empathetic listening. And that context or framework you're describing is even like, you know, I even include like, hey, there's appreciative listening, right? Where you're listening to things, you know, like music, right? Or the giggle of your, you know, grandchild or whatever, right? There's just giving them some context of all the different types of listenings. I have about 4 categories, and that helps people to just kind of, there's informational where you're trying to actually like learn something. Right? You're trying to, you know, get information and process it. So I can share kind of the overview that I use as a framework. I can pull it up and send it in later.
Okay, so what I was hearing there is the different types of empathy. Like we have appreciative, informational. I think, I don't know if you've seen the ULAB process. They list a variety of listening approaches too, with kind of going deeper and deeper to where empathic is kind of like this deepest level of listening. So kind of giving that as, looks like we're making a book here. Getting into depth. There is in terms of, I added blocks to empathy, and I've got a web page where I've got like over 30 blocks to empathy. So, but maybe a couple blocks would be, you know, would be helpful. Okay.
Well, it's interesting because blocks to empathy, I mean, I kind of agree with Myrna that it's about empathetic listening. Yes, we're talking about empathy in a bigger context, but in this, for the application here is empathetic listening. So some of the blocks often are about distractions, right? And being present and in the moment and focused with your attention on the listener. I mean, on the speaker. So it'll be interesting. We might even want a blocks to empathy up above generally, and then a blocks to empathetic listening, because they might be different. There might be some overlap, but.
We also might want to put the opposite of what the block is. So in terms of priming, the person, because we may, that's all.
It's hard to just say, don't do this. You have to replace it with something else. Yeah.
I have a point to make here. I think everything that we are talking about is only on the information part. I think if we combine or make a combination of what this information is along with why, in the sense that we are talking about beginners, right? So not everybody understands the difference between what is the takeaway from a compassionate conversation vis-a-vis if we see a empathic conversation, right? So whenever somebody is becoming part of an empathic circle, then they need to first understand and settle with this feeling that empathic conversation is going to give them this takeaway, and that's why we are doing an empathic kind of communication. So if we associate whatever we are talking about, the information on what empathy is or what empathic kind of communication is, to why and what the takeaway is, I think it will sort out a lot of chunks and pieces of what information we would want to put in and how it can, further help the people or the participants in the circle.
Do you have something, Martin?
Well, I was just processing what Mernal was saying there. So if I understand you correctly, Mernal, you were saying that rather than using definitions, focus on the takeaway from the conversation. So if the takeaway from the conversation is information, that's one thing. If the takeaway from the conversation is making the person feel heard, that's something else. Or if the takeaway from the conversation is exhibiting some compassion. So focus on that as the thing that defines what's going on in our conversation.
Yes, if I put it in one single phrase, then it would be setting the right expectations just before we start an empathic circle, because not everybody is going to understand that language in so much of details as it is listed on various websites or books or all of those things. So we have to put a brief on what this means and why this is important for this kind of a setup. And what is it that you're going to gain out of it? Because nobody gets interested without they know what is the output of it. Right. Okay. So if you tell me that I have to engage in a conversation and I don't know what is going to be the output, I might be half interested. But the moment I know that, yes, I might not receive any sympathetic response from any of the listeners, but this is what I'm going to gain out of it. And that is the reason why this is being done. I would be more into the conversation rather than, being distracted out of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so in empathy circles, the intention is to make the person feel heard.
Well, and also for connection, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that could. Oh, yeah, Liza. Sorry.
Well, yeah, and even if we could take that and make it descriptive, sometimes that's very helpful. So, for example, this is the example that came to my mind while Mernal was speaking. Was a friend of mine who really eschews all things spiritual, was just like, I don't get it. And I said, well, just imagine you're lying. Where's the most peaceful place you can imagine? And he said, in the middle of a forest lying on a boat. And I said, all right, just imagine you're in the middle of a forest lying on a boat. That's all. And and then he could understand it because he had generated the experience himself. So somehow also, I know with my teaching is what I'm always trying to do is evoke an experience, because they can't unexperience something, so even if there could be a description of an experience of what empathy feels like, so it moves them somehow from their evaluative into their visceral.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing, though, that would be really great, and I know it's not written word, but it's to go along with these is the videos.
Right.
I think that words are only, us talking about it is super meta, right? And we're only going to be able to get them to a certain level, especially people that are more experientially, focused or experiential learners. So being able to see a video of this whole process will ground the instructions in something that's real world. So I would say even maybe embedded links on any sort of a document that is online would be helpful. But obviously, there will be some description around modeling it for the people, whoever's like leading it. I usually try to model it first. We don't say that in the one pager, but the suggestion to model it, I think, helps people get it in their body better.
That's something that came up yesterday too, so we could use Zoom, where we have 4 people. So you have a little empathy circle. We can actually draw arrows, like now Martin is speaking to Myrnal, and then now she's reflecting back. So it could be, like a sample there. There was also what came up for me was the brainstorming of why is empathy important to you, and why empathic listening is important. And within the human-centered design process, they have something called the 5 whys. So we could interview each other and say, why is empathy important to you? And then you say, why is that important? Why is that important? So that keeps getting it down to the core why. And that would be kind of an exercise that I think would be kind of interesting to do, in our group, or maybe in pairs. And then the other thing I was hearing there is about creating metaphors and experiences. So it's getting it out of the cognitive and into more kind of the visceral felt experience, and how do we describe the physical, get people, since empathy for me is like feeling into, right? It's the essence of feeling into. Like if we feel into this group, like what is the feeling that we have here? It's like, I can feel the creativity, the ideas, the kind of the energy. I can feel enthusiasm, kind of the curiosity, for example. So anyway, that was a couple ideas.
Yeah, I tried to jot those down on the outline as well, include those in. I think this is like a really good start. Part of it is the only other thing that I can think of to add to this, because I think this is a great framework, is whenever I'm doing anything in person, and I try to do it in writing as well, is just to think about all the different personality types and what their needs are, right? And so I think this definitely speaks to when you're talking about the what and the why and talking about empathy, I think that speaks to the feelers. I think the specific how-to steps is more of the process or organizational or detail focused people, right? Because they want more concrete, yeah, that's all nice, but what am I actually going to do? And then I think the experiential piece we're talking about, and either modeling it, demoing it, having videos will help the people that are more experiential and need a little bit more of an engagement or stimulation to get excited about it. But the one group that I'm wondering if especially because this is the furthest away from their comfort zone, is the thinkers. And thinkers often need research or some sort of analysis that basically legitimizes things, right? To help them feel comfortable in trying things or accepting them and not being skeptical. So some little bit, I don't mean heavily, because I think the 20-pager or the book is where there's going to be a lot more of that, where you can have more space to do that. But something about the research or the research studies or something to legitimize it for the thinkers.
Yeah, I think that in terms of legitimizing it for the thinkers, maybe a good resource, because people love the brain, would be research in mirror neurons. And then, just how mirror neurons help us learn implicitly. So basically by engaging in empathy, you're learning. It's the fastest way to learn. As we all know, that's why we're, but there's something about, or there could be a focus on dopamine, like the excitement of novel stimulation. I think something neurological or neurochemical for thinkers. Like my experience with thinkers is that they just like, it makes them relax. Like if it's very neurologically based, it's like, all right, we're good, you know. So
well, and
oxytocin.
Thinkers are often stuck in their head, right? That's, they get caught up in their head. And when you know, your definition of feel into it, right? This idea of trying to be more in touch with your body and or connecting your mind and your body, this is gonna be really uncomfortable for them, right? So being able to kind of hold their hand and walk them through why to at least be open-minded about it, right? Because they have a tendency of wanting to, you know, be more judgmental, right, about things, and unless there's supporting evidence. So just trying to think about, when we build this kind of argument we're giving, just making sure that we're thinking about all the different personalities, so that we have something for everybody.
Well, yeah, I think that, no, go ahead, Martin.
Oh, I was just going to say, thank you for that, Valerie. I feel validated.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, I think the thing about, well, with mirror neurons, for example, if we're thinking about how usually we use mirror neurons to evaluate, like, is this like me or not like me? But how this actually allows the prefrontal cortex to engage with the mirror neurons to actually go beyond our habits, you know, like that is something that thinkers can just like latch onto, because it's like, more doing, you know. I mean, I seem like a feeler, but I'm really a closet thinker. So
we all have all of these things in us, right? To varying degrees of preference. So I feel you, because I do a lot of work in Silicon Valley with tech people, right? And partially because I can do both, right? I can do thinker and I can do feeler. And so I can try to be that bridge. But the other thing is, I don't necessarily know if it makes sense to like heavily inundate this 5-page with a bunch of like heady theory, right? But at the same time, maybe it's that to support this type of thing, we throw them a little bone. Then we have other articles and things maybe we could link to that are outside of this, but like there's like a thinkers section to the site or something that really just gives them everything that they can dive into to feel like, okay, well, I'm willing to at least, because they like to be open-minded about things, but feelings is one of those areas that I think instinctively, you know.
I saw that with someone was saying she's a feeler, her husband's a thinker. She'd been talking about empathy, you know, he didn't get it. Then she started talking about mirror neurons, and suddenly it all kind of made sense to him. But there's another aspect to this, is if you have feelers, the concrete, the experiential, and the thinkers, is what do each of those experiences feel like? So my question is what does reason feel like? Reason has a felt experience to it. So I've thought even doing a little article on the feeling of reason, because people assume reason is detached from feeling, but actually reason has a felt experience to it, and people wouldn't use what they call reason if it didn't feel good to them. So
that's brilliant.
Yeah, we do a lot of that. That's the whole thing with the acting techniques, is that we get to feel all these different ways. You know, for example, one way to feel like a feeler is to put your energy center inside of your head, and especially in your eyes. And then all of a sudden, like, you'll see all the details around you, and all the details and how they'll work together become very interesting. Versus if your energy center is like down in your pelvis, then you're just going to want to bust things up.
You can move your energy to kind of take these different roles.
And just to see the world in different ways. Sorry, it's my area.
No, that's great. It seems to me that empathy is feeling. It's like it's moving. How do we move to a greater awareness of the felt experience of life? And even if you're a thinker, sometimes it's like thinking is really about kind of the feeling of rigidity and control. Like, right, we're trying to suppress other feelings or keep a sense of, you know, balance or whatever it is. I remember I interviewed somebody at a conference. He was a Republican. He said, you know, his biggest value was reason. I said, well, what does reason feel like? And he said, well, when I was growing up, I felt really insecure, you know, moving through the world. And I found if I thought about things, I felt secure. I felt safe. I felt grounded. So there was certain.
that's
certain.
where they find that, that's where they find their well-being is
Mhm.
in facts and research and sort of the more known, logical framework. It's really interesting because I think that what Martin said, and I think even Eliza, is that we're going to attract people that are this combo. I mean, we can't proselytize to think the hardcore thinkers who are not willing to even conceive of feeling anything, right? Like, the Spocks of the world are not going to be interested in this. But the combo of thinker-feeler personality types, right, who are willing to, at least entertain it and play in this space, those are the people that, I think we're going to have that will be more receptive to trying to find balance.
I think the Spocks of the world, do have a place in this continuum as well. Perhaps it's on the fact that, using empathy for them as a tool yields better results in whatever path they want to go down.
Martin, I totally agree. But the problem is that's a totally different conversation and a totally different writing style if we're targeting them than something that would work for everybody. And so I'm saying on this one, let's just assume that the thinkers we're talking about already are somewhat receptive, and that maybe a separate document or a separate approach is needed for a really focused attempt at trying to bring them,
a remedial approach
that kind of maybe doesn't speak to everybody.
Right.
Yeah, this is what's tricky and interesting about the skins idea, and how to have a branded home that aesthetically appeals to everybody and then effectively funnels them correctly. Because I don't think that the actual empathy circle process is that hard. I don't think that's where a lot of the emphasis needs to go in terms of explanation. It's more about when I was first starting to do this work and kind of interviewing OB people, and they were all like, well, what's empathy for? Why would you want that? And so, it's more like that, a sexy site which everyone would like, that also seems practical, and then easily funneled pockets so everyone can find their aesthetic way in or something. You know what I mean?
The one thing I'll say, I'm doing a bunch of branding work right now for my business, and I'm working with entrepreneurs, and one of as well, they're my target. And one of the messages that I knew intellectually, and I'm coming to accept much more in my body right now, is that you can't be all things to all people, right? And so identifying our audience, and at least, again, being an iterative process, right? Where in the beginning, the more narrow we can actually define our target for the first go around, the more effective we will be to get it off the ground in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And then we can build and add the other skins or the other targets, right, as time goes on. But I think that the target that's going to be the most receptive to us, right, and empathy circles is probably where we should focus our attention and speak directly to them for clarity of message.
It's a little bit like listening. We were listening on Sproul Plaza last week, and in Berkeley, that you see that Sproul Plaza, you see Berkeley, and the students are so focused and directed, and they just walk right past you with no awareness. But yet there's other people, it's like you can just feel their openness, and they're just kind of,
and it's like your experience in those two meetings, right? The people that were open to it, it was a totally different experience in the sandpaper group who, they weren't willing to even, conceive of it.
Yeah.
And for us, it's going to be too hard to try to convince the sandpaper folks.
But don't we want those sandpaper folks?
I think that right now we need to support and grow a movement around people, just increase the usage of it with people that would be early adopters. And then over time, it's going to be a slow process before we can get the sandpaper folks.
Oh, Myrna, you had your hand up there.
Yeah. I was hearing all the conversation regarding the personality and understanding and putting up that thing in perspective. So my question was, would it make sense to segregate it in a different way? Who are our target groups? For example, if we are targeting corporations, so we are expecting to encounter this particular set of people or this particular type of personality traits more often than the other type. So for example, thinkers and feelers. So if we are going to organize this kind of circle in a IT firm, which is totally tech people, so can we assume something like that? I mean, I would need an expert advice on this. I don't know about it, but just clicked my mind that can it be done in a different way?
So we're going to be pulled back into the other group in about 10 seconds. So I did jot that down. So segregated by groups. So I think we're got 2 seconds. I think, yep, there we go.
Hello. So here we are, all back. Lots of rich ideas in our small group circle, and yeah, I think this is just a time for wrap up. So if somebody wants to share an idea that came up in your group that you are excited about, and then we'll do a debrief and closure.
Well, I feel excited about the many possibilities and alternatives that this empathy cycle seems to have.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll just say real quick, we kind of came up with an outline for that 5-pager, like just a real rough kind of framework. But then we got into discussion around, again, sort of the idea of the target audience and how there are different personality types. And we got into the discussion about thinker versus feeler. And we kind of got into a cul-de-sac around who are we trying to target, and are we going to be effective if we're trying to target everybody, or do we need to target people that are in the beginning that are going to be more receptive? So.
Interesting. Thank you for that update. So just a sec. A follow-on to that is that my experience in groups has been that we can go a little further if instead of trying to decide one way, we say, okay, who wants to write a prototype for a feeler and who wants to write a prototype for a thinker? And then we do a both and with it, so that then we end up having twice the amount of product instead of spending all that time trying to choose one or the other. So if somebody wants to, yeah.
So here's the one thing, Rosa, in my experience also with my business, is that, and I think it was our experience of what brought us here around the Culture of Empathy website originally, is that we don't want it to be everything, right, under the sun, because it makes it super hard for people to get to what they need. So just trying to be really clear about our intention and our focus. I think in the beginning, it's not to say we couldn't add things on later, but making sure that there's a clear message will help everybody know what's what and, get what they need.
Okay, so to wrap it up then, what is your recommendation about what that starting point should be? Do you think it should be on for the feelings or for the things?
I was saying that whoever our target needs to include, that we're not proselytizing to people that I use the term Spocks, right? People that are such hardcore thinkers that they're not even open or receptive to the idea at this point, that we need to, that our target should be anybody who is at least open to the idea of empathy, right?
Okay. So does anybody here have any issues with that? Having at the initial, okay. So yes, Myrtle?
Yeah. So the biggest problem I see with that is, at least if I see it in the context of India that I live in, most of the people predominantly don't understand what empathy is, and they might have reservations of getting into a empathic conversation rather than a compassionate conversation, because that's how the culture defines the setup is. So I think rather than shying away from somebody who doesn't want to, get involved. See, I understand that we're talking about personality groups, but then if we go ahead with that kind of a mission and with that kind of a vision that somebody who understands empathy or is willing to join empathy groups is going to be the targets, then I think we are skewing it a lot. That's one thing I feel.
Yeah. So again, I think that this was kind of part of the way that we set this up at the beginning. We're getting a lot of input from you guys, and we're going to end up creating something from it, but we don't want to limit it. So if you feel inspired, Myrnal, to create a version that would be really helpful for India, I think it would be awesome if you took some initiative to create that, because we're not a business. We're not paying you guys anything to be here. We are totally dependent on your goodwill and your energy and your enthusiasm. And so the best way I know how to spark that is if we encourage each of you to create whatever you're inspired to create. And then we're going to pick and choose how we organize it on the website so that it doesn't look like it's all over the map, and so that it's like that, but that you will gain a lot of value from creating a prototype, whether or not we're able to use it, and we are going to try and use as much as we can. So if that makes sense. So so please feel free to design something that you think would really work in your context, to come back and share it with us, and then we will, based on that, we will learn a lot, and we may borrow some of those ideas, and everything that we are creating is going to be free for everyone here to use. Up to you to what extent you want to donate the thing that you've created to us. But we really hope that this process will spark everyone's creative juices, and that we'll be able to, each of us create a lot on our own, as well as have something in common. So does that work for everyone? Yeah? Awesome. Cool. Over to you, Violeta.
I just really like, we talked about the do's and the don'ts for the active listeners. We talked a lot about the role of the active listener in our group. And I think it was important to me from the very beginning, thinking about empathy circles, that this 5-pager would have a little bit more focus on what the active listener could do so that they're most helpful and efficient.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, Eliza.
We talked a lot about why empathy is important and what the felt sense of empathy is. And Edwin had the idea that maybe in a future session, we would either in pairs or in our small groups take turns talking about or just answering that questions for ourselves, in order to then create text that we could maybe put in the document in order to kind of evoke that experiential sense in the reader of the document. So it's not just descriptive, it's also, or it's not just that's not the word, it's not just explaining the why in kind of a dry way, but it's kind of giving them the why in an experiential way.
Oh, cool. So we would partner at a future time in order to talk about what our felt sense is of why this work means something to us, or why empathy is, and then almost like we would write a little testimony that kind of coming from that experience to kind of make it a bit juicier, so it isn't just an instruction thing, but it has some personal voice. Ooh, awesome. Very cool. All right. Anyone else?
Just building on that comes out of the human-centered design process. So when doing interviews, I would ask you, Rosa, why is empathy important to you? And then, I don't know, what would come up, for example? Can you just say one word?
One word of safety.
Okay, and why is safety important to you?
Okay,
but
well,
I'll stop there, but it's the 5 whys like that. You just keep pushing why, and you kind of work it down to deeper and deeper kind of feelings that are important to you. So.
Okay. Awesome.
I remember that process from when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I think.
That's why it's so powerful.
Awesome. Okay. my apologies for the bumpiness of this. I feel like in hindsight, I could have been a little better prepared in terms of having especially shown you all the graphic before we broke up into groups, because there were some questions in our group about that, about the different stages. And just really want to thank Alara and our group for taking notes and for catching the time that it was probably time for us to join back together again. And just really appreciating all of the really good ideas that you guys have come up with. So closing thoughts. Let's do a circle of closing thoughts. Just anything that you're taking away from the meeting or any feedback that you want to give. Who'd like to start?
Okay, I'll do that.
Yes, Manu.
Yeah. So it was my first interaction, and I think I've learned a lot. So many diverse people who have a lot of experience, way more experience than me. So I think I have learned a lot about not only empathy, but also about, various other aspects that would be helpful in understanding empathy in a larger picture, as well as people in a larger picture. So I think this has been a great experience. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
You want to go?
Good.
I love the intention. I love the intensity. I love the expressions, and I'm really grateful.
I didn't find it bumpy, just to reflect that back to you, in my experience. And I think it would be really helpful for me if there was a link in the email that went along with the link to the group of what document, of one document. But and if it's possible, like if we're going to be looking at 3 documents or so during the course of a time, it would be helpful to get those links like half an hour beforehand, just to have a look at them. We got that one 20 minutes before, but for some reason I'm having a hard time navigating the site. I mean, I can click on the links, but I'm having a hard time kind of understanding how it's put together. So if we have like, these are the 3 documents that we're talking about today embedded in the email, for me, that would be really helpful.
Number one, I want to say thank you for the reminder email. That's been very helpful as a quick, easy way to find the link. Also, I just love this group. I love that it's all over the world, right? Because I think that the different perspectives, like Myrna saying about like, hey, in India, we've got a different, uphill battle, right? So, and even Salvador had mentioned that he was creating one, with his language, right? And so I think that kind of cross-cultural perspective is really important. So thank you to all of you from all over the world for contributing and collaborating on this. It's very meaningful.
I'd love to. Sorry, Salvador.
Go.
Okay. I just, this is absolutely brilliant. It just puts my whole being into such a great place every time I listen to everybody talk and the things that you say. So it's just a wonderful 2 hours to just be here, even if I contribute some small little thing. Thank you all so very much.
I feel also very grateful and very excited about some ideas that I want to try with my students, psychotherapy students, in the next meeting that I will have in 2 weeks.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I just had one feedback while you were talking. I was just overwhelmed with all the information that people are sharing, and with so much of diverse experience. I heard the recording of 15th March conversation that was in my absentia. So I was just making a request here that can we have a way in which we can have an intra-sharing platform. So if I have a question on personality, I can perhaps reach out to Valerie and take some of those things offline and then come back more informed in the next meeting. because it's not.
We have a Facebook group actually for everyone here.
Oh, okay. All right.
So have you not checked out yet?
Me?
Yes. Alara, please.
And Violetta. Hey, hi. Manal, would you say your name for me? Because I just...
Oh, sure. It's Mrinal.
Mrinal. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Sure, it's not perfect coming out of my face. Let's see. Checking out with... Yeah, so I felt like this hot air balloon with a lot of sandbags and coming into the call. And I still, kind of feel that, but I'm getting... just being on the call with where all of you are at, it's helping me look up more. And so the process is supporting me as an individual. And I'm hoping that in some way, I think I'm pretty an impatient person. And so Rosa, I loved that you gave me a context. Like, you're going to take this and run with it as you and Edwin kind of see fit. And then, but there's also all these ideas that we can work with as we want as well. So there's autonomy, but there's also some clarity for me to not get attached to all these things coming out, that you guys are going to make the decisions that you are. So that was helpful. So I can just be a little bit more relaxed with the process. So there's a lot more, but I know we have time crunchy, and I love the small group breakouts. Thank you. I liked hearing people's voices and having a lot more energy for my being. So thanks. And my skin just looks bright orange. It's really not. I'm not like a Cheeto alien. I don't know what's happening with the screen. So thanks. I'm done.
Hey, it's in fashion in this country. I'm full of ideas now, and I'm going back to my country in 3 weeks, and I'm supposed to work with small businesses that came to me and said, hey, can you teach us empathy? Because our people don't know how to approach customers with empathy. So I'm going to do some empathy circles, and I'm just having a lot of ideas about how to do it. And since I'll be there for only 3 months, I'll be back. So I'm thinking of writing all these things in my language and kind of tweaking them to our culture. So I won't share that to you, Rosa, with you, because you can learn Bulgarian. It's possible. But
it's possible.
But, yeah. So thank you, everybody, for being so open and supportive.
I just want to make a clarification. Oh, wait.
I just want to check out, check in. Just a metaphor came to me. I feel like I'm in this warm bath of presence. So with everyone, and I do feel a little anxiety. It's always like how to move from this sense of presence to all these pieces of the puzzle that came together, and how will they start fitting together in an effective way. So there's a little anxiety about how are these pieces going to fit together. So, but I do feel like I'm in this warm kind of creative bath. So that's it.
Well, that's actually the perfect setup for my clarification. And if I may take just a minute, I know it's 3:04, but I wanted to clarify that, because Edwin keeps asking me this, how's this all going to come together? And I'm like, we're going to need to bring it together. So it doesn't come together on its own. I mean, I think the self-organization is sometimes misunderstood as, oh, we don't need to do anything and things will just happen. And actually self-organization is a lot of people working hard at bringing stuff with a lot of freedom and initiative, but there needs to be work done there. So you guys have committed to six sessions with 2 hours, right? But Edwin and I had to get together and incorporate all the feedback into that one pager and say, okay, here's a next draft to bring to you. So there's a lot of work in between, and it doesn't have to be just us. It's like Crystal and the other group said, wow, I want to volunteer to design a website. So the website is going to be Crystal and Edwin and I, because she's going to put in a lot of work in between times to do it, right? So anybody, if Myrtle wants to create a whole program that is for people in India, she will create it, and then we will link to it on the website and say, hey, and if you're from India, here's all of this stuff. You know, we will link to the stuff in Spanish. We will link to the stuff in Bulgaria. So whatever you create will be included in whatever we create. And if you want to meet in between the times to have a working thing on how we put all this, it's like, we're certainly open to it, but it is going to need, to pull it together is going to need some additional work beyond what we're doing in these 6 2-hour things. And at this point in time, the ones who are committed to doing that is Edwin and I, because it just needs to be done. And you're welcome, if you want to be involved in that part of it too, to step forward into that. But these groups aren't going to be doing a lot of decision making and nitty gritty, et cetera, because if we were doing that, we would get a lot less far. These are for creative feedback, inspiration, looking at what everyone's doing and like that. Does that help? Awesome. Cool. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.